When gifting an interest in an entity, usually the ownership is determined pre and post gift by percent ownership and by number of shares. And it's hard to know the values of those entity interests because of the need for an appraisal and the risk of a gift tax audit by the IRS. So, there may be a more optimal way to make gifts of entity interest by instead transferring a fixed dollar amount instead of a percent ownership interest or a certain number of shares. Because if the IRS later changes the value of that interest or number of shares, you can have a fixed amount of the gift up front, and then the percent or number of shares would later be finally established when the IRS and the taxpayer agree or concede on the value for gift tax purposes. There's a number of pitfalls to know and avoid, which are revealed in a series of tax court cases we'll look at here. But either way, fixed value clauses are good, but do require a lot of homework and custom drafting. I'm Griffin Bridgers, and this is 10 Minutes with Griffin. For today's episode 193, we're going to look at defined value formula clauses as revealed in the tax court case of Wandry and beyond. As always, this presentation is not intended to substitute for legal or tax advice. It is provided for educational purposes only. And if you'd like a copy of these slides, please email me at griffin.bridgers@gmail.com. Now on to our discussion. Now, when you define ownership in entities, you typically define it not by a fixed dollar amount, but by percent ownership or by number of shares. This is because valuation of an entity is extremely fluid. It changes day to day. So to define a fixed dollar amount outside of maybe a class of stock with a fixed liquidation right can be extremely difficult. But the problem here is when we're making gifts of interest in entities, gifts are dependent on a dollar amount because that's going to determine how much applicable credit is used and how much gift tax is payable. And when we look at this, if we were to say transfer a percent ownership interest or number of shares, there's usually discounts that might be involved. The bare value might be in dispute as well when the IRS starts to examine the gift tax return. That gift amount could be increased after the fact, which results potentially in a deficiency in gift tax or an unanticipated gift tax liability. So, what can we do to define the amount transferred without risking a payment of gift tax on audit? Because a lot of times with entities, the IRS has a lot of incentive to go in and challenge the valuation. Where we find a solution is in a defined value formula clause. Now, the IRS has fought these tooth and nail throughout the years and sometimes successfully, but the premise is that from the outset, what you intend to do is not transfer a fixed percent ownership or a fixed number of shares, but instead a fixed dollar amount of interest or shares, which will ultimately be determined in terms of percent ownership or number of shares when finally there's agreement or concession between the IRS and the donor as to the value. That could happen once the limitations period is passed for the gift tax return, or when the dust settles on any sort of audit or even tax court case. Now, there have been a number of cases through the years which have addressed these. Sometimes the IRS is successful, sometimes the taxpayer is successful, but we can read some tea leaves among those. Wandry, which is a 2012 case from a 2004 gift, is often considered as the gold standard for defined value formula clauses, but there's additional guidance in cases such as Procter and Nelson. And I'm not really going to make this a detailed discussion of those cases because there's a broader audience than just attorneys here, but what I want to do is address some of the high points from these cases with both a good drafting scenario and a bad drafting scenario based on each case. Now, first off, the IRS has policy arguments against this that you have to avoid, because the IRS has often argued that this formula clause disincentivizes or discourages enforcement of the gift tax after the fact. So the first key point here to avoid a policy argument is to note that you can't reverse a gift after the fact once the IRS comes back and challenges it. So if you make a gift now and just say, hey, this gift is fully established, and then down the road the IRS challenges it and you claim, okay, well, if the IRS tries to assert gift tax, then the portion of the gift that generates the gift tax is reversed. Well, the IRS doesn't like that. That's a condition subsequent, and what the IRS wants to see is fixed rights up front. So a bad type of transfer would be one where you're transferring X percent to donee that has a appraised dollar value of Y dollars, but if the IRS increases this value in a gift tax audit, Z percent will be transferred back to the donor. That doesn't work. That runs afoul of the policy argument here. Better outcome is if you have an entity worth X dollars, and regardless of the value finally determined for gift tax purposes, the donee will own Y dollar of entity interests and the donor will own Z dollars of entity interests. So that might be better. You could also state Y and Z as a percent, but this is really the fact pattern from the case of Procter, where the IRS was forced to honor a formula clause that allocated rights between charitable and non-charitable beneficiaries that could be adjusted, and what the tax court found is that the dollar value to non-charitable and charitable beneficiaries was fixed up front, but was subject to adjustment on the back end in terms of the actual percent ownership based on the value finally determined for federal gift tax purposes. Now, to establish these fixed rights and avoid any sort of condition subsequent or gift back, what you have to do is use some sort of fixed pecuniary dollar amount for the gift and not a percent ownership interest or number of shares. So down the road, you can let the dust settle and know what entity interest was actually transferred, but the entity interest that is ultimately transferred may not be known for many years, but will ultimately be equal to this dollar amount. So what you're doing is fixing the dollar amount up front. You're not going to adjust the dollar amount at all, so there's no condition subsequent. So in this case, what we have is that IRS could come back and try to adjust the percent ownership or the number of shares, but they can't adjust that fixed value because that fixed value is the amount finally determined for federal gift tax purposes. So a bad outcome might be that we have X percent interest in entity to donee, the appraised value of which is Y. Well, if that appraised value is increased, then that's going to increase the percent that goes to the donee or the amount of the gift. So a good outcome would be maybe we say we have an entity interest worth X dollars as finally determined for federal gift tax purposes, and the donor intends to get a good faith appraisal to set this dollar value and to determine the amount of the entity transferred. But if the IRS comes back after the fact and adjusts that fixed value, then the percent ownership will be adjusted effective as of the gift date and not effective as of the date of the change in value. So for more on this, you can see the Wandry case, which I cited as the gold standard for this wording. Ultimately, what you're doing here is you're looking at this the same as maybe an estate tax clause that would use a formula for determining the marital deduction, or even the charitable deduction for that matter. Then finally, it's important to make sure that the adjustment is any adjustment that's made for establishing the value for federal gift tax purposes. So you need these magic words in here that the fixed value will be the amount finally determined for federal gift tax purposes and not the amount appraised. So a bad outcome might be to say that we have an entity interest worth X dollars to donee, so we have our fixed value, but that's based on a good faith appraisal to be obtained by the donor within X days of the gift. Well, in that case, you have transferred a fixed value, but it's not based on the fixed value for gift tax purposes, but instead on the fixed appraised value. And if that appraised value is increased, then that's going to increase really the amount of the gift and really make this be a transfer of a percent ownership interest. So there was no fixed value for gift tax purposes here. It was really a percent interest because it's based on a fixed appraisal. What we want is the appraised value to potentially be fluid as well to determine that percent. So a good outcome might be an entity interest worth X dollars with these magic words added as finally determined for federal gift tax purposes to the donee based on a good faith appraisal to be obtained by the donor within X days of gift, but subject to adjustment if the IRS challenges this appraisal and changes the value finally determined for federal gift tax purposes. Now, for more on this, you can see Nelson, which was kind of a weird case to really wrap your head around, but yeah, really the IRS's gripe was without using the magic words as finally determined for federal gift tax purposes, that there wasn't a transfer of a fixed dollar amount, there was instead a transfer of a percent ownership in an entity, which was subject to adjustment and could increase the gift tax ultimately paid. So what's happening here is that up front, you're irrevocably setting the dollar amount of the gift being made. And while the percent ownership may not be known for a while, and maybe even 10 plus years if there's a tax court case, you still are not running afoul of any sort of condition subsequent because you're fixing a gift of a set dollar amount up front. And then down the road, when the dust finally settles, when there is an agreement or concession on the value, the percent ownership or number of shares will be finally established at that point. Now, it's important to note that this is for gift tax purposes, but an adjustment to that percent or number of shares is really what wags the dog when it comes to income tax returns for the entity and maybe even distributions of income. So it may be easiest, at least, to avoid amending income tax returns to use a grantor trust with a defined value clause so that the donor is treated as the owner of the entity for income tax purposes throughout the period of examination, both before and after the gift and before and after any adjustment that might occur. As always, if you have questions or topic suggestions on this topic and not on specific client matters, you can email me at griffin.bridgers@gmail.com. But thank you for listening to this episode of 10 Minutes with Griffin, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.